I'm excited to be on week 6 of my book tour for Social Startup Success, How the Best Nonprofits Launch, Scale Up, and Make a Difference. And I have been traveling all over the country in front of different audiences. And I also have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 2-year-old at home. And so this is my 4th baby in a way. And so the question that I seem to get asked so often on the road is, why on earth did you decide to write a book and have 3 kids in 3 years? And it's a question my husband asks me quite often also. But, you know, my answer is always the same, because this work matters. It's the same reason why all of you are here tonight, that everyone in this room is committed to making this world a better place. And the exciting thing is that we've seen a groundswell of innovation and activism over the past several years, and new ideas being applied to social change like never before. And that's a good thing, because the problems that we're trying to address are huge, whether it's increasing inequality, growing gap between the rich and the poor, the climate change. There's no shortage of problems that we must solve in this world. The problem is that not all nonprofit organizations are created equally, that good ideas and big intentions are not enough to assure that an organization will have impact. And so I wanted to start by sharing a story of an organization that I feature in the book that I think really embodies the reason why I wrote Social Startup Success. So Rob Gittin from At the Crossroads, who both Gemma and Natalie know, was a college student at Stanford. And like many of my students, Rob chose his class schedule based on the classes that met after 2 p.m. because he liked to sleep in. And so Rob stumbled literally into this class one day, Homelessness in America, and his life was forever changed. He was volunteering with homeless youth in San Jose. He was really taking a passion to helping these kids who had been let down at every stage of their lives by the foster care system, by the juvenile justice system, by their families, by the government. And he really liked the hard cases, the kids who really were getting let down by all the other social service organizations. And so when he was coming to his senior year, he decided to start an organization really as a self-employment plan so he could keep hanging out with homeless kids. And he was lucky to get an Echoing Green Fellowship to give him the seed money to start that organization. And he was off. He was doing outreach in San Francisco with his new organization At the Crossroads from 7 p.m. till 7 a.m. all night long, walking the streets of the Tenderloin. And he was really loving the work and taking a lot of satisfaction out of helping kids one by one by one. The problem is he realized that he was only going to get so far helping them one by one by one, and that if he really wanted to make an impact and make a difference in the broader problem of homelessness in San Francisco, that he was going to have to start a much bigger organization, and he was going to have to build a movement. But Rob was 22, and he had never been hired before, let alone hired anyone himself. He didn't have access to networks of high net worth individuals to raise the millions of dollars that he would need to support this organization. And he didn't know where to begin measuring the impact of his work. And Rob's story is really the story of so many young, passionate social entrepreneurs who get into this work because they care so much about social change, but realize that that passion and charisma is only going to take them so far. And I know a little bit about that story because it was my story too. I was a young lawyer in San Francisco. I was billing hours by day at the law firm. And by night, I was co-founding an organization, Spark, to engage young professionals in San Francisco in new forms of philanthropy to support gender equality issues. Spark was amazing. We had a ton of buzz. We had lines around the block for our events. We were doubling our revenue every few months, which actually, it turns out when you start with $1,000, you can double your revenue for quite a long time and still not get very far. But we were making progress. And then we hit a wall, and we couldn't get the capital that we needed to grow the organization and have the impact that we really wanted to see. And so, wearing my research cap at Stanford, where I teach social entrepreneurship, I became really curious. What is it that makes an organization succeed? And I learned that this wall is a real thing, that actually 2/3 of nonprofits in the United States are $500,000 and below in revenue. And for many small community-based organizations, that's plenty of capital to do their work. But for many organizations, it meant constantly being on a treadmill, just trying to make payroll every month and keep their organization alive, as opposed to really focusing on the impact that these organizations could be having. And so for the past 5 years, I've been traveling the country, surveying hundreds of organizations and sitting down with 100 social entrepreneurs, with their staff, their beneficiaries, their funders, all to get to the bottom of this single question. Why is it that some organizations succeed and scale while others don't? And so as I think about social startup success, it's the playbook that I wish I had when we co-founded Spark. And it's the playbook that my Stanford students have been asking me for years. It's a toolkit of the 5 best practices of the most effective organizations: testing and innovation, measuring impact, funding experimentation, collective leadership, and storytelling. Today, Rob Gittin runs a $2 million organization and is serving hundreds of homeless youth in San Francisco. So he has reached a level of scale that he hoped for when he started the organization. The problem is it took him 20 years to get there. And I just think that the social problems that we're facing can't wait for young people to learn these skills on the job. And so my hope is that we can use these tools to accelerate social change, and that readers can come away with a strong sense of what it takes to make a difference in the world. Bill Drayton, who is often called the godfather of social entrepreneurship, says that it's no longer enough to give someone a fish or to even teach a person to fish, that we have to revolutionize the fishing industry. This is what social entrepreneurship is all about. It's not just about giving a homeless person a meal or finding a bed for that homeless person. It's about solving the problems that are creating homelessness in the first place. And that is really exciting. I am really excited to have 2 incredible social entrepreneurs on stage here tonight, Gemma Boulos from the Global Women's Water Initiative and Natalie Fields from Accountability Council. And I define a social entrepreneur as anyone who uses innovation to create social change. In social startup success, I define scale as organizations that are able to get over this hump of $500,000 to a level of $2 million and beyond, which both Gemma and Natalie have done in their ventures. So I'm going to let each of them take a couple of minutes to introduce themselves and talk about how they got into this work and what their organization does, and then we'll have some questions.
Great. I guess I'll start. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with my dear friends, Kathleen and Gemma, and also wanted to thank the World Affairs Council for hosting this event. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to look at the lessons from Kathleen's book as they relate to so many of the topics, especially as they relate to World Affairs, which is our work at Accountability Council. And I started this work really in the 90s as a student And I found myself in Chile in 1998 when the Biobío Dam was going up. And it was the very first time the Biobío was being dammed on the sacred land of the Mapuche people. The Mapuche indigenous people have lived in that region for many hundreds of years. And when I happened to be there on one particular day, it was the day that the bulldozers were coming to push these people off their land. I was a student at the time. I was there for an internship. I happened to be in the Alto Biobío to witness a protest that they were doing. And by happenstance, I was the only American, the only foreigner, the only non-local person on the Hill. And because of that status of being an American, someone in the crowd pointed to me as she was being handcuffed by the military police and taken into a truck for defending her land against these trucks building this dam. She said, it's your government funding this project through the World Bank. You need to tell the world this is happening. And she was absolutely right. You know, I was a lowly college student. What did I know? What power did I have? And yet I had disproportionate power because of my status, because of my race, my class, my education, my nationality. That was a real call to action, and I took it seriously and took the responsibility of that position that I have very seriously. That's the spark, so to speak, that led to Accountability Council many years later. So I was on a quest for how is it that there's this unequal balance of power between the communities on whose land these big projects are being built and the power of the corporations and institutions financing them that are not listening to those people who should be the very beneficiaries of these projects, not the objects or the victims of these projects. That this is a really unequal situation that doesn't need to be. So we don't need to be choosing between rights and development, or the environment and development. And here in 2018, that's still the proposition that Accountability Council was founded to challenge. So fast forward, I spent a decade as a litigator trying to figure out whether, you know, in the testing mode, I guess, of the issue, is litigation, suing corporations and institutions, a viable method of accountability? Had some successes as a litigator, but it would take a decade to get to a victory. And even when we had a victory, it was, you know, millions of dollars of fees of many attorneys, huge teams, and the benefits would go to maybe just a small handful of people. And then I looked around back at this strategy of looking at these big development projects, these big investments where sometimes one project would impact 1 million people, where an entire watershed would be displaced. Not just their own lives, but their children's lives and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren's lives and on. And thinking, well, there's got to be a way to deal with this. So I stopped litigating. I put that chapter of my life to rest and founded Accountability Council in 2009 with the idea that there is an alternative to litigation tied to the banks that are financing these projects. They have their own accountability offices that no one's heard of, that were set up to receive community complaints, but they were vastly underutilized. So we decided to narrow and focus on using these accountability offices through a three-pronged approach, helping communities through direct legal services to help communities know about and then use effectively these complaint offices through the last mile, all the way till they get remedy for the harm or have prevented the harm. And then from a policy perspective, looking at the systemic change, knowing that these institutions created accountability offices in the first place as a compromise with civil society. They gave up some of their power at the demand of civil society, but they're not going to keep it in that balance unless civil society keeps the pressure on that demand. So Accountability Council was founded to be that countervailing force to ensure that there's a transparent and independent accessible forum for communities to use from a policy perspective. And to look at where are we playing whack-a-mole. We don't want the World Bank to have an accountability office, but then everyone goes to get financing from China where there's no accountability office. So working to plug the accountability gaps and work at a global systems level. And then finally, we have a research team, which is providing the data, the information, the resources to make evidence-based policy determinations and advice, and also to look at patterns in the data of every complaint ever brought to every accountability office and seeking to scale that and launch that as a public good. So that's the rather longer story of how Accountability Council came to be. And we went from a one-person team in 2009 to now a 14-person global team, working half of our team in the global south, half in the global north, and working to continue our scaling from here.
Thank you, Natalie. And I neglected to mention that I'm also the board chair of Accountability Council, so I'm a little bit biased in thinking that their work is super important and impactful. Gemma, you have a very circuitous story of how you got into this work. Tell us a little bit about your story and briefly what your organization does.
I will, and thank you so much for having me, of course, to be with my dear friends, as well as being able to speak to you all here, because this work and this book is so important. As I was introduced, I am the director of Global Women's Water Initiative, and I stumbled on this work. I kind of call myself this accidental activist because I didn't have any kind of background in water and sanitation. In fact, my background was as a professional jazz singer and a preschool teacher in New York City. And so after September 11th, I actually was supposed to be in the World Trade Center when the planes hit. And of course, that day changed my life and so many other people's lives. And as a songwriter, I had this notion that I wanted to do something about it. And one of the ways that I could do it as a songwriter to find my own personal healing was to write a song. And hopefully in my own personal healing in writing that song, it could be something that could help others as well. And so I had this notion that I was going to unify people again, as we were seeing it in New York City. We were seeing it in the form of grief and tragedy. I was hoping that maybe we could bring people together again, only this time through celebration, that we are all the same, that we want the same things for our families and for our communities. And so I left my life and gave away all my belongings, and I took my backpack and my guitar, and I decided I was going to build a million-voice choir around the world to sing this song. And it just so happened that song was one of the main themes of that song was this notion that it takes a single drop of water to start a wave. This metaphor inviting people to see themselves as that powerful drop of water. Their every thought, their every word, their every action being something that will ripple out, that will affect those around them. So to choose to be kind, to choose to do good in the world. And so because of that metaphor, people started to call me the water lady, the lady singing for water. And so some of the places I was getting invited to were peace conferences and conflict resolution and youth empowerment, things like that. And one of the biggest gatherings that I was invited to was the United Nations Water for Life Conference. And here I am with this, hippy-dippy message of we're all drops of water and we're all going to be able to change the world, Then I was hearing all of the tragedy around and the crisis of lack of water and sanitation around the globe. And it was there that my metaphor turned into my cause. I started to learn that there were 1.2 billion people in the world that didn't have access to water. Women and girls were disproportionately affected by it because they had to fetch the water. They either lost time working or couldn't go to school. And then, of course, 3 to 5 million people dying a year from water-related disease. And it seemed to me, what a simple answer. Just provide everyone with clean water and sanitation. And so as I was traveling around the world, I also started to learn and experience firsthand what that crisis looked like and felt like. And as I was traveling, I was very curious and asking people, what were their biggest challenges, the people who were actually providing the services, what was working, what was not working. I loved being in that constant state of curiosity and that constant state of learning. And in that learning, I ended up meeting people who actually knew how to build certain things, really simple technologies that anyone could build in the world that could provide clean water and sanitation. So after I'd mobilized this choir, we had over 100 cities and 60 countries singing We Rise, which was the song, from all over the globe, on September 21st, 2004. And so the question arose for me, wow, this is a beautiful moment. We've got 6 minutes of united song. What next? What does peace look like on the ground? So in learning about the crisis and learning of different solutions that people were implementing around the globe, I won an award from Queen Latifah and CoverGirl and took that money and went back to the Philippines, which is my country of heritage, and we started a water project. And in that water project, I learned so much because, I so enjoyed that state of knowing nothing because everything was new, and I was being able to piece together information in a way that wasn't informed by anything except the people who needed, who were involved with the crisis. And so from there, we were actually able to design a program, a community we designed a training program and an implementation program where communities completely drove and led and designed their own water and sanitation systems. And in addition, we're able to monetize it and be able to sustain it in that way. And through that work, we were able to get the Echoing Green Fellowship, which raised our visibility. And all of a sudden, we were getting known around the world as this group that was doing more, as opposed to the hardware-driven model of the delivery of water and sanitation. We were actually getting known as the software model, the ones who were training communities and using communities' wisdom and trusting the wisdom of the community to be able to deliver their own water and sanitation services. And so that led us to sub-Saharan Africa. We were invited to work with Wangari Maathai, and she helped us think about what it might look like to develop a program that was specifically focused on women, because women and girls, as I mentioned, are the ones who are disproportionately affected by it. And when you start looking at how systems change, you know, you want to be able to you don't want to just be able to provide water, because that's the fish, you know, teach a person to fish model, or just provide people with fish. What we were, what we were trying to do was go beyond that. We were going beyond, well, why is it that people don't have access to water? Is it just that they don't have the hardware? If that was the case, then why would there be a gazillion different, carcasses of broken wells and broken toilets all around the globe? It's because there was no community engagement, and nobody, and international organizations coming in and implementing, as opposed to having the communities design and implement their own. So with our program, we ended up training women, and the reason we trained women was because there needed to be a systems change. There needed to be institutionalization of education around water and sanitation and hygiene. Because if you have access to water and it's not clean, you're at risk. If you have access to clean water but you don't have toilets, you're at risk of contaminating your water systems. If you have toilets but you don't have good hygiene practices, you're at risk of water-related disease. So there needed to be a holistic approach, and it needed to come from people who would carry that knowledge. And for us, it was the mothers who were going to be at home ensuring and enforcing good practices, the ones who are going to make sure there's clean water at the table, the one who's going to make sure they wash the dishes with clean water. And so our model was to train women, village women, and 70% of the women we train actually had not graduated from the 8th grade, training them to be able to build all sorts of different water and sanitation technologies, because every community and even every household might even have a very different issue. So the women are trained to actually be able to build multiple technologies so they can customize those services to every single client that they have. And we do it in a 3-pronged approach as well. We train them as technicians so they can construct multiple technologies. We train them as trainers so they can educate others. And then we train them as social entrepreneurs so they can monetize every single service that they provide. And so what we've seen is women's leadership. It's an entry point for women's leadership in the community. We've seen women who have had no leadership in their community, who have no education, all of a sudden rise up and are now sitting on water boards and influencing local policy.
I want to ask you more about how you engage the women.
Yeah.
So maybe we can get back more to the community work in a minute.
Sure.
Thank you both so much for your incredible stories. Now you see why I did 100 interviews, because social entrepreneurs are so inspiring. I wanted to start with one of the issues that is really a hallmark of why social entrepreneurs are maybe different from traditional nonprofits. One of the ways is that there has been a huge move towards measuring impact in much more rigorous and strategic ways in order to determine whether the work that nonprofits are doing is actually having an impact. And so this is really important and has brought up the game in our sector, but at the same time, it's a really big challenge for nonprofits. 75% of nonprofits do measure their impact and collect data in some way. Only 6% of nonprofits feel that they're using that data well. And so, so I wanted to start with you, Natalie, because you operate a human rights organization. The impact that you're trying to see, policy change, might happen over decades. And so how do you incrementally, on a year-by-year, month-by-month basis, measure whether you are making progress toward that goal?
Yeah, I would say the key for human rights organizations and perhaps every social enterprise is just tailor the measurement toward the activity. So if someone is a funder and they're telling you how to measure, what should be measured and how, that's a sign that maybe your metrics aren't right if it's not someone who's deeply embedded in the issue. So for example, in our communities program, we have different metrics from our policy program, from our research program, because they all have to be targeted toward the goal. So in our policy program, one of the things we do is provide advice around, say it's the African Development Bank has an accountability office and it's going up for a revision. The policy that governs the accountability office is being revised. One of the things we would do is provide very detailed policy advice on here's your current policy, here's where we recommend it's changed to reflect best practice or better practice. And then at the end, there's a final policy that comes out. So it's a very measurable activity. So our metric is a percentage of our policy advice that we want to see taken on and reflected in a final policy. So it's a very, very targeted metric that's tied to not only the activity, but the outcomes we're seeking, with the outcome being it becomes a more independent, transparent, fair, accessible accountability office. And in the communities program, one of the things that we've started to do, we created this incredible internal thing that we call the accountability console, because we're fond of puns. And it's a powerful tool where we have our research director, who we're lucky enough is a software engineer, but it could be an Excel spreadsheet, it doesn't have to be, but he's created this beautiful tool to map our theory of change. So we've got every activity that we do in all 3 programs is listed for everyone in the organization to see in each program. That leads to the outputs that we track of each of those activities, which leads to the outcomes that we track, which leads to our ultimate impact. And that's all, each one of those things is part of our theory of change, but how the activities track to those and where these flows are happening and where there are successes and failures, we're able to not only understand, but measure and evaluate. And those are all, again, tied to the specific goals, the specific activities. So we've found that we measure by getting specific. So in our communities program, we have a case in Mongolia. The goal in the Mongolia case will be make sure there's implementation of these agreements that we helped herders to reach with a big mining company. It's very specific, it's very tailored, and that's never the goal that we would have in our case in Haiti. But it's exactly tied to our theory of change with the outcomes. So.
And the beauty of the way that you've done that is it also empowers each staff member to have ownership over the mission, which is really a part of collective leadership, right. another piece of it. Gemma, one of the things that Natalie mentioned is that she focuses on looking not just at the outputs or the activities of the organization, but the outcomes or the ultimate behavior change. And this is something I've seen in my research that a lot of organizations miss. They're really good at talking about how many people participate in their programs, not so great at talking about what the long-term outcome is on that person's behavior change or life trajectory. And this is something I know you have spent a lot of time with in your metrics and thinking about how you're not looking not just at the women who participate in your programs, but the longer term outcomes of the work. How have you done that, and how you've been super creative about leveraging universities, and maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Yes. So when I was a fellow at Stanford working with Kathleen, and we had students to do some service learning projects for us, so identify some things that we needed in our organization that we didn't have the manpower or the woman power to do. And so ours was data. Ours was collecting data. And there was plenty of data points that we could be collecting based on all the different water organizations that are in the world. Everyone generally, tracks outputs. They'll track how many people have access to water. They'll track how many technologies they've built. They track, whether if there's any kind of income, they'll track income. But that's generally it. They're generally tracking hardware. But as we started to track those, but also started to interview the women on the kinds of changes they were having in their personal lives, we started to realize it was less a water project and more of a leadership and self-reliance project. So essentially what happened was we changed our theory of change as we were developing our what we're calling our, our model program right now, because of what we were seeing in the field. We were seeing that we were only tracking a tiny little piece of it by collecting the output data, or the kinds of tangible things that were being built, or the amount of people who were being affected. And what we were seeing, because of this empowerment of women, not only being able to construct and challenge gender stereotypes, women are even forbidden just to go up ladders, and here they are walking up ladders and hanging gutters. They were also making money, and they were also educating people around the community. And this kind of activity was very uncommon in their communities. So they would tell us stories about how their husbands used to treat them one way, and now all of a sudden treating them another, including them. And and we started to look for questions that would identify sort of that kind of transformation. So the kinds of questions we were asking the women was not just about how many technologies they built, not how much money they were making, but how people were seeing them in the community and how they were seeing themselves. So when you start looking at this sort of self-determination model and trying to track how the confidence level and how they see themselves in the world and how others see them, it changed considerably. Because one of the reasons why we love working in water is because water is one of those needs that everybody agrees upon, right? The smallest plant and the richest man are equal in that they need water to survive. So what ended up happening, where you would think there would be resistance because there were women who were climbing ladders, forbidden, or they were building tanks or wearing overalls or mixing cement or laying bricks. Where you would think that they would get pushback from the community, they were actually getting support, because everybody agreed that water was something, if nobody else was going to be able to provide it, might as well be the women, right? And so for us, we saw major behavior change, not only in the women and their agency, their ability to speak to others and influence them, their ability to make money, their confidence in charging for their time, their professional time. We also saw community members starting to see them as leaders, starting to look to them for answers, starting to brag about them, and talk about how these women are doing amazing things in their community, and getting more and more women to engage. So what that has sort of led up to is this really robust impact tracking system. We went from our outputs just being, the amount of people that we were providing water and sanitation to, and even, the technologies, to sort of, outcomes, these early outcomes, which were seeing women being comfortable charging for their time, seeing women, have the capacity to build things and train and actually earn money doing that. And then the long term, where we're seeing people not only taking water seriously, but also looking to women as the providers of that wisdom. So for us, that was our long-term strategy, which is why we ended up turning our theory of change around. It went from, being this water program to this leadership program disguised as a water program.
Yeah. It reminds me of a quote from Albert Einstein. He said once, if you gave me 60 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 of them defining the problem and 5 of them solving it. And I think that really is so key in social entrepreneurship is as you're thinking about how you define the problem, it really shapes how you ultimately solve that problem too. So in your case, the problem is not just that people don't have clean water, it's that there are people within the community who are not empowered, and that shifts your model. I want to take a question from the audience. Someone says, how do we empower community-based startups? Is that important? What are the differences you've seen between local and non-local startups? And I think this is a really interesting question in the context of both of your work. You're doing global work and acting as really powerful advocates from afar. And so that, if Brian Stevenson the great civil rights activist who talks about in order to have an impact, you have to have proximity. How do you stay proximate and earn that trust from the communities that you work with?
We call ourselves a community-led organization, and we take that very seriously. So the way that manifests is that we only work at the request of communities, for example. So if we hear about a project that's caused harm, we're not taking a plane there to go stir up a case. We work through NGO networks. So we require civil society organizations at the very, very most grassroots level to be hearing from communities that are in their proximate neighborhoods that are affected by projects that are causing human rights and environmental abuses, to then reach up to the regional and international organizations who know us. So through usually 2 degrees of separation, we're getting requests from community-based organizations or directly affected people themselves. So we ensure that we're a trusted and wanted and needed partner by having that as our very first screen. The decision-making in every case is community-led. So all we're doing is providing information about what are the available tools that fit into maybe an existing strategy. Maybe here's a set of strategies to consider, but we would never take any steps forward in a case unless the community is making the decision about whether they want that strategy at all and how they want it to fit into an existing fabric of maybe local political organizing or media or shareholder activism and all the other elements that may be necessary for a campaign to work. So it's taking direction from the people who need to sustain the movement and also recognizing it as part movement building, part community organizing, part lawyering, and that we try to play really a backseat role to the communities doing that organizing.
How about you, Gemma? And how do you work with, what is your role in empowering local organizations and working with local startups as well?
So we work with local women-led and women-focused African organizations in East Africa, and how we identify them is we put out a call for applications through organizations like foundations that have already funded them, so we know they've already been vetted. And what we do is we are a training organization. We just, again, provide information, and that information is brought to them in a really holistic way, and they get to decide how they use that information. So our strategy in this for these last 4 years is to build the capacity of 2 local women's organizations to take over our operations and to be able to be the trainers of the local trainers in sub-Saharan Africa. So essentially what we've been doing is working, we have 2 women from Kenya and 2 women from Uganda who have started their own organizations, and we're starting to hand over operations to them in a way that will help them not only raise their own money, but also to be able to deliver the kinds of trainings that we have been able to deliver, but are actually much more localized and much more customized for local women. And what's been great to see is that when we started, we have always had local people train. I've never been the one to train our women's organizations unless it was something that no one else knew how to do, like water testing or something, or chlorine making. But in terms of building the local structures, like tanks and toilets and things like that, these are things that we can hire local African women to do. So essentially what's been happening is that these 4 years, they've slowly started to take over our operations, and by 2021, we're going to hand over all of our East African operations to our local staff so that we can work in another region. So for us, it's really about building local expertise. Every time, if we ever go in the community to collect data, they're always, of course, coming to us and asking for our support. We can actually be there to say, actually, these are the women you need to be talking to. They've built everything. They know how to do it, and they're going to be here for the long run. They can help you when things break. And so we can actually also become their cheerleaders in their communities just to reinforce the kind of expertise that they're providing. That is something that no one else in their community can provide.
Can I answer a little bit more of the question that was asked too about how to build these community-based organizations from where we sit? And I love your model, Gemma. It's so powerful. We started in 2013 what's called an International Advocates Working Group. very, very aware that Accountability Council alone as an organization will fail if we're the only ones doing what we're doing. It's movement building that we're really in the business of, and it's grassroots communities who are the front lines of that movement building. And in that process, we now have 140 members from all over the world, including grassroots organizations, who a piece of their work is using these accountability strategies as a method for attaining a more just world. And what we're seeing is the real need for those community-based organizations to get the same level of network and support and information and training about how to run a nonprofit in order to attract capital and to succeed, and just to have the basic level of money that they need to survive, to do the work that they need to do at the grassroots level. Yeah. And so, you know, your book is going to be shared, obviously, through this network as skills that are needed everywhere. So this is not just international organizations, but everyone can benefit from the lessons from the book, and also from solidarity. And I think that's the message of yours too, is train the trainer, train each other, and also just provide capacity and support to give a leg up to those who you can identify that need it and will use it.
And definitely looking at that movement building, because that's eventually what ends up happening when you have that kind of community, you know, mobilization and community empowerment. The women that we've trained over 200 women in East Africa alone, and those women are now they want to create their own network, and they want to do it in a way that they're going to be gathering on their own, sharing their own information, because as I mentioned, we give them information, and they do with it what they will. And, you know, ultimately what ends up happening is these women come in with very different techniques that they've done in their community based on their relationship with their leaders, with their neighbors, and everyone learns from each other. And so building that sort of local capacity will then start rippling out and start building into some movements, and they can actually now start, we've got some women who are coming together and actually trying to influence national policy in Kenya now because of this knowledge, and they're all from different regions in the country.
So powerful. I want to shift to the question of fundraising. We have a couple of audience questions about fundraising. This is a big question. In fact, 81% of the organizations that I surveyed said that access to capital was their number one challenge as an organization. So this is a big challenge in the nonprofit sector. And it was also the number one catalyst, getting a big grant or some sort of big funding boost to scaling an organization. So it's both the biggest challenge as well as one of the most important factors to scale. So you, Gemma, you started to allude to this, have a very interesting funding model where you have been able to develop a way for the organization to become self-sustaining through earned income for the women that you work with. Tell us a little bit about how you've been able to use earned income as a strategy to support the organization.
Sure. So when we first offer, the women learn how to build a new technology and learn more in depth about an issue in water and sanitation every single year. And so the first year, for example, they're learning how to build a rainwater harvesting system and tank, and learning all about water access, and learning all of this hygiene education on how to reduce the risk of water-related disease. And so when what we do is we identify the women-led or women-focused organizations in the region who will be sponsoring to come to these trainings. They identify 2 women who come in and they learn at a core training. So we call these our core trainees. And then when they, after they learn everything together with these 10 other organizations coming from the different regions, they go back home, and then we provide them financial support. They apply for a grant, and we help them actually improve their grant writing skills in that way. We also provide them with technical support by sending our East African technician to be able to help them build that first technology. And then we send one of our country directors who can help them organize the training. Oftentimes, I mean, these women have never put together a construction site. And so they identify then 10 more women, and those 10 women get trained by building this first technology with all of our support. before they can come back the next year to learn how to build toilets and learn all about sanitation, they have to match our investment, which means they need to raise enough money to build another tank. And so in doing that every single year with every single technology that they do, they actually not only end up matching our investment, what we found is they ultimately, through the data that we've been collecting, they were supposed to have built just over 200 technologies, and they ended up building over 1,000 on their own, raising their own money, because we challenged them to raise their own funds.
And they raised that money from within the community.
Yep.
And I think that's important in the context of the work that you're doing, because like you said earlier, water is a fundamental need for survival, and so people might be more willing to pay for water than they would for human rights, say. So Nally, how have you dealt with trying to generate alternative revenue streams in your work? Is that a viable option for Accountability Council?
Yeah, we are an entirely philanthropically funded organization. We made that decision early on because we had the urgent desire to help those who absolutely have nothing to spare. So we're talking people who don't operate in a cash economy, people who are indigenous fisher folk in the Amazon who have oil contaminating their water, and they're literally fighting to survive. So serving very, very marginalized populations who are really struggling is a priority for us. Those are the folks we want to reach and be able to serve, regardless of need, regardless of the ability to pay. So with a philanthropic model, I think the challenge is sustaining it, right? Because as you said, self-sustaining revenue is self-sustaining, and if it's not coming from there, it has to come from philanthropic sources. So we started off with individual donors as a very, very small percentage of our budget, and are mostly foundation funded still today. That's the majority of our funding. And we've toyed with the idea of what a revenue model would look like on our policy side, because there we give probably hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of free policy advice annually to these big corporations and institutions who very well can pay for them. But we made the decision to remain independent so that there's no conflict of interest. We want to be able to help a community file a complaint to that very same institution at the same time as we're giving them policy advice for how their complaint office should work better. So in order to avoid those conflicts, and in order to gain the trust of the communities who, we work with, we have to earn their trust every day. We need to remain independent. And so we're always exploring and always testing whether there's a conduit where we could package our research and our information and our data to a third party who is independent that we could then use to generate revenue. And that's always something that we'll continue to look at and be open to. But at this point, we're philanthropically funded, and we can talk about the challenges of doing that as well.
Yeah. Well, I want to follow up on that, because we live in a region where so many tech donors in particular who have been successful in the business sector, want to apply those principles to the nonprofit world and try to push organizations to be more quote unquote sustainable with earned income. And so, this is something that I'm sure you've heard. I mean, a lot of organizations that I've interviewed have gone into foundations, and the first question they ask is, well, how are you going to be sustainable? And so how do you, as an organization that is fully supported on philanthropy, how do you push back on that? And then also a question from the audience is, how do you go about figuring out foundations that are values compatible with your organization?
Right.
And how do you stay true to your values and fundraise at the same time?
Right. Yeah, we've been very, very fortunate in that we've found a community of foundations who give core support. So that's, I think, for human rights organizations as well, incredibly important that they're not giving project-specific money, especially for legal organizations like ours, where timing can shift, locations can shift, priorities can shift depending on the opportunity. So being nimble with core support has been great. The way that we found our donors was through enormous amounts of coffee. I can't tell you how many people I have coffee with on a regular basis. And it's asking the person you're meeting, do you know anyone I should meet who would be interested in this issue? And then that next person, do you know anyone I should meet? And expanding the network of people who know about and potentially care about your issue, and helping them be your ambassadors to find the person who cares about your issue. So for every 10 coffees, maybe there's one that leads to the person who's going to identify the person who deeply, deeply cares about your issue, that leads to a long-term 3-year core support grant. So that's the hard work of pounding the pavement, which to me is easy compared to what the attorneys that I'm fundraising for have to do, or the communities we serve. But that's the work of fundraising in a nutshell.
Yeah. So now if we all know why Natalie might be a little bit jittery tonight, she's had quite a lot of coffee. But I think one of the things that you've done so brilliantly is that you have made fundraising a team effort, that it's not just this lonely endeavor that I think a lot of nonprofit leaders face on a day in, day out basis of just feeling like they're in it alone. I mean, you really have tapped into other people and made them your allies and your champions in fundraising. And that is one of the strategies that I have heard over and over again as a key to success. So you guys are tackling these very slim populations that you're serving, really in the midst of huge need. And so what is your end game as you think about what the role is of your organization in the broader movement and how you scale? And a question from the audience, what is the role of government in social entrepreneurship?
So for us, the end game is that people around the globe are able to have access to clean water and sanitation, and are self-reliant. And so we don't necessarily focus on these big infrastructure projects like wells that will provide, an entire village. We like self-reliance at the household level because that's where people take the most responsibility. They'll make sure they'll invest in it. They'll make sure it's taken care of. They'll make sure they'll invest in any kind of repair and things like that. For us, the other end game is we believe that that the women are the ones who that have been excluded from any of the processes. Just making sure that they are not only included, not just because they're meeting some sort of gender quota for having half women on any kind of water council, is to make sure that when they're sitting at that table, they have expertise. They're actually being able to contribute meaningfully and have strategies and solutions in ways that can help the entire community and not just little pockets of it. And in terms of working with government, what's great about women is they share knowledge. We recently did some research this past summer, interviewing all the women in Uganda who actually are able to build water and sanitation technologies. And we found that comparing them to men, they are the ones who go home and teach the hygiene practices. They're the ones who enforce all these things. And the women that we invested in them only to build technologies. We didn't give them any extra money to do workshops. But that didn't stop them. They actually ended up offering 295 free workshops to their communities, impacting and influencing over 14,000 people. They share knowledge without anyone telling them that they have to, and then they also gather. The women, a majority of the women that we train are part of women's groups, and so they come together and they either start their own businesses together, or they come together and start thinking about what it is they can do to improve their community. So working with women also has that benefit because they have this incredible network that can mobilize like that. You can just call the next women's group in the next town and they can all mobilize within the hour. And then finally, with that network, not only locally, but connected to the other women that we're training, they can actually start having much more influence, not only in the region, but inviting them to these larger sort of water and sanitation conferences to be influential in that way as well.
Mm-hmm. Natalie?
Yeah. Right. Well, while in our communities program, we only have about a dozen or so cases at a time, so maybe thousands and thousands of people out of the millions and millions who are impacted. The ultimate goal, the ultimate impact we're trying to create in the world is that communities have agency in the decisions that affect them. So instead of being seen as obstacles to development, they're partners in their own development. They're the ones making the decisions that affect their daily lives and environments. We want to see accountability systems that are fair and effective and can deter bad practice because they are effective, but we also want to see corporations and institutions that are preventing the type of practices that are leading to harm in the first place. So we have again, our 3 programs are directly correlated to the ultimate impact that we want to see. That's really systems change level work. Also tying through the whole thing is incentives. What are the incentives of institutions and corporations that need to be adjusted and aligned so that we're not fighting against the tide all the time, to make sure that the incentives for big institutions whose job is, as the World Bank's is, poverty alleviation, that they're incentivized to look at development outcomes, not just loans out the door, so that the accountability structure and frameworks naturally fit to get better outcomes.
So a little bit of work on your hands. I think you're both self-employed for a while. And I'll add on the question of the role of government and social entrepreneurship. I mean, ultimately, social entrepreneurs are providing an incubation service to governments. That governments are really the engine of scale for organizations. The largest nonprofit organizations like Teach for America, for example, which has grown past an $80 million budget and is one of the largest nonprofits in the United States, is still only serving a sliver of the teaching population in this country. And so if we think about what real scale looks like, the city government for the city of New York has an annual budget of $22 billion. There's no foundation that is giving away that kind of money. And so accessing the city and local and federal governments is critical to scale. And I'll give one story that I think shows this well is Last Mile Health, founded by Raj Punjabi in Liberia. He was someone who was left the country just as the Civil War was happening and was able to escape with his family, but his memories of escaping haunted him, and he always wanted to go back and help. And so he did help the country rebuild. After medical school, he went to Liberia, and he saw that he was going to be able to create this incredible community health worker program to bring so much treatment and diagnoses to rural areas that hadn't had it before. There were people walking sick 12 to 13 hours to get treatment in the capital city. And so he was really smart, though, because he realized that if he really wanted to be successful, he was going to have to engage the government. And so from day one, he started sending reports to the Minister of Health about these programs that he was operating and how effective they were. And he heard, actually, in this big conference, he heard the Minister of Health actually quote from one of his reports. And he realized that this Minister of Health was really appreciating the program, and he figured out a way to implement it into policy in Liberia so that it actually became a line item on the government's budget, and they were able to scale that program much farther within the rural areas. And that was critical in 2012 when the Ebola crisis hit, because had there not been community healthcare workers in those rural areas, we might be living in a very different world, and that public health crisis could have spread much farther. And so I think that is really, when we think about the potential of social entrepreneurship, when we think about the potential of nonprofits to make a difference in this world, I think that story really illustrates it well. Last question for the recorded portion is, what is one piece of advice you wish someone told you before starting your organization? Or what is one piece of advice you would give a budding change maker?
Gemma?
Ask a lot of questions. Be curious. Don't think you know everything. Don't think you know anything. There's so, I think where where I learned the most were from the people who didn't have anything. You know, the people with the least resources are the most resourceful. So, you know, who do you look to for answers when you want to talk about innovation? Who do you want to look to for answers when you are talking about survival, about getting by, about, you know, basic human needs? You know, those are the people that you want to talk to. So be curious. Know that everyone you talk to in the community is your teacher.
Good advice. I would say two things. One is don't be afraid to fail. So within every social enterprise, there are things people have tried. There are budgets that haven't been met. There are, you know, really hard battles that you fight and you don't always win. But if you're in systems change as a field, you're gonna have stumbling blocks along the way, and to just be tenacious in your stamina and to keep at it, and don't be afraid to ask for help from unlikely places. So people who you may be intimidated by may be just waiting for you to ask for a leg up to help get you where you need to go. And so to be also tenacious in seeking support in every place you can find it.
Amen. Well, my advice would, of course, be to read Social Startup Success. And to seek mentors. I think that we all have so much to learn from those who have come before us, and vice versa. And I think developing more opportunities for two-way mentorship between generations is just a really powerful opportunity for social change. And I'd just like to take a moment to thank our amazing panelists. Natalie and Gemma, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And for your wisdom.